What if I told you that the most baffling case of my entire career didn't happen during my 35 years on the force, but 3 years after I hung up my badge? My name is Detective Frank Morrison, and at 70 years old, I thought my crime-solving days were behind me. I was wrong, dead wrong. The case that would consume my retirement started on what seemed like the most ordinary Tuesday morning in September. I was sipping my coffee, reading the local paper in my quiet suburban neighborhood of Millbrook when my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 30s with tears streaming down her face and desperation in her eyes. "Detective Morrison," she said, her voice trembling, "I know you're retired, but I need your help. The police won't listen to me, and I don't know where else to turn. Now, in my 3 decades as a detective, I'd seen every kind of case you could imagine. Murder, robbery, fraud, missing persons, you name it, I'd worked it. But something about Sarah's plea struck a chord deep in my chest. Maybe it was the way her hands shook as she clutched a manila envelope, or maybe it was the haunted look in her eyes that reminded me of cases that had kept me awake at night. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Tell me what's going on." Sarah settled into my living room, the same chair where I'd been peacefully reading mystery novels for the past 3 years. She opened the envelope and pulled out a series of photographs. What I saw made my blood run cold. The photo showed her younger brother, David Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer who had supposedly died in a car accident 6 months earlier. But these weren't accident photos. These were surveillance images, taken just 2 weeks ago, showing David very much alive, walking through downtown Seattle. "The police said I was imagining things," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said grief makes people see things that aren't there. But I know my brother. I know his walk, his posture, even the way he holds his coffee cup. This is David." I leaned forward, my detective instincts kicking in for the first time in years. "Tell me about the accident." Sarah's story unfolded like a puzzle with missing pieces. David had been driving home from work on a rainy evening in March. His car had skidded off Highway 18, crashed through a guardrail, and plunged into the Yakima River. The vehicle was recovered, but David's body was never found. The rushing water, the police had explained, could have carried him miles downstream. But here's where it gets interesting, whoa, and where my 35 years of experience started screaming that something was wrong. David was an excellent swimmer. He'd been on his high school swim team and continued swimming laps at the local pool 3 times a week. The idea that he couldn't have survived long enough to reach shore seemed unlikely. "Did David have any enemies?" I asked, falling back into my old interrogation rhythm. "Any debts? Any problems at work?" Sarah shook her head. "David was the most cautious person I knew. He didn't gamble, didn't drink much, and he'd been at the same job for 4 years. His biggest excitement was playing video games online." That's when she mentioned something that made my detective radar go haywire. 3 days before the accident, David had called her, sounding unusually paranoid. He'd said he thought someone was following him, but when Sarah pressed for details, he'd brushed it off as work stress. I studied the surveillance photos again. The image quality wasn't great, but there were distinctive features that were hard to ignore. A small scar above the left eyebrow that David had gotten from a childhood accident. The way he favored his right leg slightly, a remnant from a soccer injury in college. "Sarah," I said, making a decision that would change both our lives, "I believe you, and I'm going to help you find out what really happened to your brother." The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. Oh boy. I started working a case. I began by visiting the accident site, driving the same route David would have taken that fateful night. The stretch of Highway 18 where the accident occurred was notorious for its dangerous curves, especially in wet conditions. But as I stood at the crash site, looking at the skid marks that were still faintly visible, something didn't add up. The skid marks were too straight, too controlled. In my experience, when someone loses control on a wet road, the marks show panic, erratic steering, overcorrection. These marks suggested someone who was deliberately steering toward the guardrail. I spent the next week diving deep into David's background. I talked to his coworkers, his friends, his neighbors. What emerged was a picture of a man living a double life. By day, David was a mild-mannered software engineer working on database management systems, but by night, he was something else entirely. Through a contact I still had in the cybercrime division, I learned that David had been moonlighting as a freelance cybersecurity consultant. More specifically, he'd been helping small businesses protect themselves from online threats. Nothing illegal, but it put him in contact with a shadowy world of hackers, corporate espionage, and digital warfare. The breakthrough came when I discovered that David had been working on a particularly sensitive case in the weeks before his death. A local startup called Nextech Solutions had hired him to investigate a series of cyber attacks on their servers. The attacks weren't random They were surgical, targeted, designed to steal specific proprietary information about a revolutionary new encryption algorithm. I arranged to meet with Marcus Webb, Nextech's CEO, at his downtown office. Webb was a nervous man in his 50s, the kind of person who looks over his shoulder even in a crowded restaurant. When I mentioned David's name, I saw something flash across his face. Fear. David was good at his job, Webb said carefully. Too good, maybe. What do you mean by that? Webb hesitated, then pulled out a tablet and showed me a series of encrypted messages. David found something. The cyber attacks weren't coming from outside hackers trying to break in. They were coming from inside the company. Someone with administrative access was systematically copying our most valuable data. The plot was thickening, and I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had driven me through 3 decades of police work. David hadn't just discovered corporate espionage. He'd identified the person responsible, and that person had decided David needed to disappear. "Do you know who it was?" I asked. Webb shook his head. David said he was close to proving it, but he needed more time. He scheduled a meeting with me for the Monday after his accident to reveal everything. That meeting never happened. I left Webb's office with a new theory forming in my mind. David had faked his own death to escape whoever was trying to silence him. But if that was true, why hadn't he contacted his sister? Why let her suffer, thinking he was dead? The answer came 2 days later when I was reviewing David's financial records. 3 months before his death, he'd taken out a significant life insurance policy, $500,000 with Sarah as the beneficiary. If David was alive, Sarah couldn't claim the money. But if she was grieving his death, she might not think to file the claim immediately. That's when I realized David wasn't just hiding from a corporate spy, he was protecting his sister from becoming a target too. Armed with this new information, I made a decision that would have gotten me fired if I were still on the force. I was going to Seattle to find David Chen myself. The address where the surveillance photos were taken led me to a small apartment complex in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. I spent 2 days conducting old-fashioned surveillance, watching the building, learning the routines of the residents. On the 3rd day, I saw him. David Chen walked out of the building at 7:23 a.m., just as he had every morning for the past week, according to my observations. He looked older, thinner, with a beard that changed his appearance significantly. But it was definitely him. I followed him to a small internet cafe 6 blocks away, where he spent 3 hours every day. Through the window, I could see him working on a laptop, occasionally looking over his shoulder. This was a man living in fear, constantly watching for threats that might never come. Instead of confronting him directly, I made a different choice. I ordered a coffee and sat at the table next to his. After about an hour, I spoke without looking at him. "Your sister misses you, David." He froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. Slowly, he turned to look at me. "Who are you?" he whispered. "I'm the detective she hired to find you, and I think it's time you came home." What followed was the most emotional conversation of my career. David broke down, explaining how he'd discovered that Helen Martinez, Nextech's head of security, had been selling company secrets to a competitor. When she realized David was getting close to exposing her, she'd threatened not just him, but Sarah as well. She knew where Sarah lived, where she worked, even what route she took to the grocery store, David said, tears streaming down his face. I had to disappear. It was the only way to keep her safe. "But you didn't disappear," I pointed out. "You faked your death and then came back to life in Seattle. That's not disappearing. That's hiding." David nodded miserably. "I couldn't leave it alone. I've been gathering evidence, building a case against Helen. I'm almost ready to turn everything over to the FBI. Almost ready isn't good enough, I said firmly. Your sister has been grieving for 6 months. She's been carrying guilt, wondering if she could have done something to prevent your death. You're not just hiding from Helen Martinez. You're torturing the person you're trying to protect. The next phase of our plan required careful coordination. David had indeed compiled extensive evidence of Helen's corporate espionage, including financial records, communication logs, and even video footage of her accessing secured servers after hours. But we needed to ensure that turning this evidence over to the authorities wouldn't put Sarah in danger. I called in another favor from my old contacts, this time reaching out to Agent Patricia Coleman from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. Patricia and I had worked together on several cases over the years, and I trusted her to handle the situation with the discretion it required. The operation we planned was like something out of a movie. We would simultaneously arrest Helen Martinez while David revealed himself to Sarah, ensuring that the threat was neutralized before Sarah learned her brother was alive. The timing had to be perfect. On a Thursday morning in October, exactly 7 months after David's supposed death, everything came together. FBI agents arrested Helen Martinez at her office, seizing her computers and finding evidence of over $2 million in payments from Nextech's competitor. At the same moment, I was driving Sarah to what she thought was a meeting with a witness who might have new information about David's case. Instead, I drove her to a small park in Millbrook, where David was waiting on a bench, looking nervous and hopeful. The reunion was everything you might expect: tears, anger, relief, and joy, all mixed together in a moment that reminded me why I'd become a detective in the first place. Not for the thrill of the chase or the satisfaction of solving puzzles, but for moments like this when justice and love intersect. But our story wasn't quite over yet. The legal aftermath was complicated. David's fake death had involved insurance fraud, even though he'd never intended to claim the money. The district attorney's office had to decide whether to press charges against a man who'd been protecting his sister from corporate criminals. In the end, David received 2 years probation and community service. He testified against Helen Martinez, whose conviction resulted in a 15-year prison sentence. Nextech Solutions implemented new security protocols and offered David a full-time position as their head of cybersecurity. Sarah and David's relationship took months to heal. Trust once broken doesn't repair overnight, even between family members. But they worked through it with the help of family counseling and a lot of honest conversations about fear, love, and the choices we make to protect the people we care about. As for me, solving the case reminded me that retirement doesn't mean the end of purpose. It just means finding new ways to use the skills and experience you've gathered over a lifetime. I've since started a small private investigation business specializing in cases that the police can't or won't pursue. The David Chen case taught me that sometimes the most complex mysteries aren't about who committed the crime, but about understanding why good people make desperate choices. David wasn't a criminal. He was a brother trying to protect his sister in the only way he knew how. My job wasn't just to find him, but to help him find a better way. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation. David was marrying his longtime girlfriend Lisa in a small ceremony in Seattle. Sarah was the maid of honor. At the reception, David pulled me aside. "I know I put you through hell," he said, "but thank you for not giving up on us." "That's what detectives do," I replied. "We don't give up on people." Now, at 70 years old, I've learned that the best cases aren't always the ones that make headlines or win awards. Sometimes, the most important case is the one that reminds you why you became a detective in the first place, to help people find their way back to each other. The Chen case will always be special to me because it proved that even in retirement, even when you think your crime-solving days are behind you, there's always one more mystery waiting to be solved. And sometimes, that mystery isn't just about finding the truth, ou amour. It's about finding the courage to face it.